I want to wish you and your families, the circle of your loved ones, the community about you, a happy and sweet and healthy new year, a year of blessing, a year of renewal, a year of new strength and new vision and new wisdom. And we pray that perhaps sometime during this year, we might all come together again to share prayer and to share learning and to share the joys of friendship and community. But now let's learn together. In the springtime of the year 586 BCE, the armies of the Babylonian Empire laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. The city's destruction, the burning of the Holy Temple, the exile of its people would all soon follow. All the while, the prophet Jeremiah sat in prison accused of treason. For 40 years, Jeremiah had warned of this. For 40 years, he castigated his people, warning if they failed to fulfill their obligations to God, catastrophe would surely follow. For 40 years, he rebuked them and implored them, trying to persuade them to become a city worthy of God's presence. And now, as the catastrophe was imminent, he sat forgotten and alone in prison. Then teaches the Bible, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. Your cousin Hananel has a piece of property for sale in your hometown. He will come to you with an offer. Buy it. Really? Really? The apocalypse is about to begin? The end of the world? And God is suddenly a real estate agent? Really? What kind of deal could this be anyway? Who buys property in a city under siege, about to be destroyed? But Hananel came with the offer, and Jeremiah complied. He bought the property, and God instructed him, take the documents, take the deed of purchase, put it into an earthen jar so it might be preserved. And then God said, I promise you, houses, fields, vineyards will one day again be purchased in this land. And now Jeremiah understood. He understood. His people needed no more warnings, no more rebuke. Now they needed hope. Now they needed to know they weren't abandoned. For 40 years he preached tzedek, the rule of God's justice. Now he was called to preach chesed, the blessings of God's love. For 40 years his prophecy was driven by rage at the moral failings of his people, and by fear at the catastrophe that was occurring outside, and sadness at the fate of his people. But now it was time to turn from rage and fear and sadness to hope and to faith. Buy the land. Invest yourself in hope. We've seen global pandemic. We've seen economic catastrophe, social upheaval, political turmoil, environmental disaster, rising hate. Last night there was an earthquake. I thought it was the end of the world. It was the apocalypse. You can't help but wonder if God isn't trying to tell us something. The answer is yes. Same thing God told Jeremiah. God is asking us to invest in hope. Remember what the supermarkets were like at the beginning of the pandemic? We were afraid. So we ran to snag cartfuls of toilet paper and cleaning supplies and baking flour. It was disconcerting to see empty shelves in suburban markets, and no one knew what the next day would bring. But the strange thing was that if you looked up from your cart, the market was still filled with all kinds of food. We couldn't see that. As we grabbed the last package of paper towel, the last bottle of Lysol, we couldn't see. We couldn't see our neighbors and what they needed. We couldn't see what was all about us. That's what fear does. Fear is a defensive reflex. Fear is a physiological response to a perceived threat. It was programmed into us by millions of years of evolution to help us survive danger. Fear kept our ancestors from being eaten. Fear keeps us from getting mugged on a downtown street. Fear protects us, but fear can become a habit, a way of life, and then it becomes a trap. Fear restricts our perceptions. Literally, it redirects blood from the part of the brain responsible for creativity and imagination. We see only what's in front of us and only what's right here, right now. We can't imagine any alternative solution. Fear isolates us from one another. Fear responds to an environment of scarcity. It perceives a world as competition for scarce resources. Everyone we meet is a competitor. Where there's fear, there's never peace. Because the competition never ends. Because there's never enough. Fear always brings its siblings: anger, self-pity, cynicism, sadness. When I realize that I'm helpless, that the world is beyond my control, I lash out in anger. Anger's a drug. It provides a rush of energy, of adrenaline. It offers a momentary fantasy of power and control, but like all drugs, it has a terrible withdrawal. And then I sulk and I complain endlessly, rehearsing all the grievances. And finally, when I can no longer escape my situation of powerlessness, I grow passive and depressed and despondent. The mystical tradition called this mochin de katnut, the smallest version of ourselves. Fear, anger, self-pity are the natural responses to loss. All of us have felt that these last months. But if we stay with them, if that's all we have, then we will end up bitter and empty and exhausted and sad. There's another way. That's what Jeremiah taught us. It's the way of hope. Hope is of a different order. Fear is a natural reflex. It erupts spontaneously. Hope comes from someplace else. Hope begins with a decision. It's the decision to accept the situation that I have in front of me and to search for all of the possibilities that are inherent in that situation. Hope begins with a decision to stand up and take a step forward, no matter how unsteady and unsure we are. How do we move from fear to hope? I am by temperament and by training a teacher. First time I ever taught anybody anything, I taught swimming at a summer camp when I was 13 years old. I was a junior model counselor. And because I was the youngest on the staff, they gave me the non-swimmer group, beginners. So I went home and I memorized the Red Cross book for beginners, and I came ready to teach. I knew everything there was about the Australian crawl and the breaststroke. But I soon discovered that's not what teaching swimming is all about. I had a 6-year-old who was terrified. He was so scared of this pool. And he hung on to the edge of the pool with white knuckles, not wanting to let go. And I said, come on, man, I'm right here. Just kick off the edge of the pool. Stretch out your hands. I'll catch you. I promise you. No, he said, no, too scared, too dangerous. I promise you, I won't let you drown. It was only 3 feet deep. I won't let you drown. And I watched him. I watched the decision in his eyes. None of that, by the way, is in the Red Cross manual. It turns out that teaching swimming has nothing to do, really, with the form of your strokes, with the position of your body. It has to do with the strength of your soul. It has to do with learning how to trust. Finally, he looked at me and realized that this was his moment of truth. Either he's going to spend the rest of his life hanging on to the edge of that pool, or he was going to swim out to me and one day go to college and go to law school. And so he pushed. He pushed off the edge of the pool and reached out, and I grabbed his hands, and he screamed, he sang, trust. That's the beginning. How do you learn how to trust in an environment of danger? That's the beginning of hope. Well, you begin, just like with swimming, with breath. You got to learn how to breathe. We have a word for this in Hebrew. The word is nishama. It's a wonderful word. It means both soul and breath. Breath opens up the constrictions inside of us. It slows down the metabolism. It changes the way we look at the world. Breath connects the inside and the outside. It banishes once and for all the fantasy that I am somehow self-contained and self-sufficient. In breath, physiology and spirituality meet each other. Spirituality begins with breathing because it unknots the anxiety, makes room for reflection and imagination, and eventually makes room for joy. In the book of Genesis, God creates us with a breath. We all have God's breath inside. And that's the most wonderful expression of the Bible. You see, in the biblical tradition, God has a proper name. Except in Jewish tradition, we never pronounce it. It's spelled Yud, He, Vav, He, but we never say it. We always say the word Adonai, my master. And over 2,000 years of hiding that name, it's been forgotten from the Jewish people. Nobody knows how that name was pronounced, except me. And I'll tell you, but you can't tell anybody where you got it from because I could get in trouble. It's really quite simple. At the end of the book of Psalms, the last line of the book of Psalms of the Bible, there's a line, Kol hanshama tehaleliyah. Every breath is praise of God. Every breath is praise of God. Well, remember, Yud, He, Vav, He. The sound of a Yud is Yah. The sound of a He is Ha. The sound of a Vav is Va. Yud, He, Vav, He. Listen carefully. Now you do that. Keep doing that. Keep doing that. What does it mean? What does it mean that the very flow of life within us is the name of God? It's a reminder that we're part of something much, much greater than ourselves. That we're a vessel. Each one of us is a vessel of the most creative power in the world. And if you ever forget that, if it ever escapes you, just take the breath again. Breathing. And from breath, learning to trust. Step one. Step two. We are to say 100 blessings a day, according to Jewish law. 100 times a day, we are to stop and thank God for the gifts of life. 100 times a day. I once taught this to a class of kids, and they complained to me, Rabbi, who has that kind of time? And there was a little girl in the back of the room who said, what? How many times a day do you say, I want? Stop and say, thank you, instead of I want. And she was right. The cultivation of gratitude is step two. Because gratitude shifts our attention from the bottomless desires for all we want to the cultivation of appreciation for what we have. Gratitude counts up all the blessings and teaches us an ethic of abundance. There's plenty in the world. We can share. And all we have, all we've gained, all that we rely on comes to us as a gift to be cherished and appreciated and shared. I don't remember much about my bar mitzvah. I don't remember more than a few words of my parsha or what the rabbi said or what I wrote in the bar mitzvah speech. I don't remember where I put the Bible they gave me. But I do remember vividly the bar mitzvah that took place in our synagogue the week after mine. The week after mine was a friend of mine, a classmate. Alan had lost his father to cancer just weeks before. His family decided to go ahead with his bar mitzvah. And after reading his Torah portion, he stood before us and he spoke about his gratitude. He shared gratitude for the time he'd spent with his dad between the bouts of chemotherapy, for the support and love of his mother and his sister, for the kindness of the community. I remember that speech vividly. And I remember how he stood there composed and resolute before a congregation as all of us wept. We wept for sadness of his loss, the depths of his love, and the power of his gratitude to heal. We wept out of wonder that a boy of just 13 had discovered life's greatest secrets. The human condition is terribly, terribly, terribly fragile. That's the lesson of these holidays, especially this year. There's only one remedy for that fragility, and that's gratitude. Gratitude is the only thing stronger than fear. A few years after 9/11, The New York Times published an astonishing document, transcript of the phone calls made from the towers in the last minutes before they fell. People who knew they were trapped, who knew they only had a moment more, took up their cell phones and they made calls, and the newspaper published a few words of those calls. I don't need to tell you that nobody called their broker. They called parents and spouses and children and friends to say thank you, to say I love you, to say you have been my blessing. If you do nothing else this holiday, if none of the prayers and none of the words move you, just do this. Call someone. Call someone who's been a blessing to you. Call someone who needs to hear from you and just say thank you. Just say thank you. Call a family member. Call your 9th grade teacher. Call your soccer coach. Just say thank you. And do it now, because life is too fragile to wait till tomorrow. Call and say thank you. And something astonishing is going to happen, I promise you. You'll make them cry, and you'll find yourself filled with an exquisite spirit of love. You feel Spirit pouring into you. So make that call. Step 3. Shneur Zalman, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, taught his Hasidim that there are moments in every religious life when even the most pious person loses faith. We lose connection with the divine. We lose our confidence in the future. We lose our vision. We lose our hope. What do you do? What do you do when you lose God in your life? And he said, you go out and do one act of chesed, one act of kindness, one gesture of selfless goodness, gentleness, and you will feel the presence of God in your hands. Reach out to someone who's lonely, feed someone who's hungry, heal someone who's sick, bring peace to someone who's anxious. One act of chesed, and you will know that God is real. You will know that God is real. Because it is in the power of deed, it is in the power of act of chesed to ultimately dismantle our fear and transcend the confines of the narrow self, to help us feel the power, the efficacy of our being. We are not helpless. We are never helpless and never hopeless if we can do one act of goodness. This is what the mystics called mochin de gadlut, the biggest version of the self. I haven't seen my dad in many months. He's been isolated because of COVID in the residence where he lives. And I miss him. I want to tell you a story about my dad. Some of you know him. Many years ago, he had a terrible stroke, found himself paralyzed on half of his body. After weeks in the hospital, they took him to Northridge Hospital for rehab, and he spent a couple of months there. So every night after work here in the synagogue, I'd go visit Pop. I'd stop at Ralph's and pick up a quart of ice cream. We loved that together. And we'd sit and we'd watch the evening news. One night I get up to my dad with my ice cream, and he says to me, Ed, I'm so glad you're here, but I can't spend too much time with you. I have an appointment. I said, Pop, it's 11 o'clock at night. Who have you been talking to? He said, I have an appointment. So we spent a few minutes. He gave me a hug. I put the ice cream in the freezer, and then he went off to his appointment. And while he was away, I asked one of the nurses, that's my dad, Dov Feinstein. Do you happen to know where he's going? And she said, oh, that's your dad. A couple of nights ago, we brought in a young man who wiped out on the freeway on his motorcycle. He's probably going to be paralyzed for the rest of his life. He's severe. None of us could get him to take his medicine, and his life depends on it. The therapist came, the psychologist came, the psychiatrist came, the social worker came. None of them could get the kid to take his medicine. And the nurse tells me, your dad wheeled himself into the kid's room and took his hand and just started talking to him. Psychiatrists, social workers, psychologists. It was Reb Dov the baker who held the kid's hand, and at the end of their conversation, the kid said, okay, I'll take the medicine. And so the next night, The psychologist, the psychiatrist, the social workers just says, send Mr. Feinstein. So my father went in and sat with the kid again, and he took his medicine, and that's the way it's been. Said the nurse, you want to know something? Your dad's an angel. He saved that kid's life. And I looked at my dad, and I saw the expression on his face. He'd been so broken by the paralysis. I said, no, saved his life. You've saved my dad's life. Said Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, only in a selfless act, only in a selfless gesture of chesed, of goodness, do we ever really discover the capacity of the self. Taught Rabbi Schulweis, my teacher, we don't believe in God, we behave God. There's a member of the synagogue years ago, survivor of the Holocaust, who told me stories about his time in the concentration camp. One winter he got very sick, and sick prisoners in the camps were typically taken out and they disappeared. So the men in his barracks covered for him, and they held him steady during the lineup, and they quieted his coughing from the guards at night. And when his fever grew worse, the men tore their bread in half and shared their rations with him. Rations, meager and stale, were all that stood between life and death in the concentration camp. And yet these men shared their rations with this young boy who was so very sick. And at last, the fever broke and he began to recover. One night he whispered into the darkness after lights out his thanks to all the men who had saved him by sharing their bread. And out of the darkness came a voice in response, no, son, thank you. Thank you. The chance to give is all we have left to remind us that we are still men and they don't own us. Wrote Viktor Frankl, the great psychiatrist of his time in Auschwitz. We lived in a concentration camp. And we can remember those who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but there were enough to offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from us but the last measure of freedom, the freedom to choose spirit, the freedom to choose hope. Over the lintel of the original Bratslaver synagogue in Europe were inscribed the words, Jews, it is forbidden to despair. How is that possible? We Jews know more catastrophe, more tragedy, more destruction than any people on earth. How did we survive? How did we stay faithful and loving and hopeful? How did we resist the slavery of fear and the bondage to anger? And the answer is, we learned what Jeremiah taught us. We invested in hope. We learned to trade fear for hope. A daily habit of acts of chesed cultivated a sense of our power and our efficacy to change the world. 100 expressions a day of gratitude cultivated a sense of abundance in the world. And investing in the soul, in neshama, feeling the closeness of God with every breath, gave us the trust and the courage so that wherever we were, even in the darkest of moments, the most evil of circumstances, we knew we were never, ever abandoned. Adonai li velo ira. God is with me, and I am not afraid. And so the anthem of our people has been, Od lo avda tikvatenu. We will not lose hope. Not now, and not ever. I wish you and yours a sweet and healthy and hopeful new year. Shana tova techatevu v'techatemu.